Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
I believe Osho, one of the sort of main sort of spiritual New Age kind of people, famous for his love of Rolls Royces, if nothing else. But he did say a lot of many great things. One of them was, when you're in love, you do not ask the question about the meaning of life. So when you really feel that you're in love, these questions of deeper meaning, why am I here, what's going on, don't seem to matter quite as much. So there is a sense in which love is tapping into something timeless, something that goes beyond all our explanations, and where you don't need to give a second explanation for it.
Broadly speaking, if you read particularly the developmental psychology of the second half of the 20th century, where love is not always used, but it's about relationships, that's the point. You can sort of discover or discern, broadly speaking, sort of four positions, I think, in relation to our development in terms of relationships. The first three are relatively uncontroversial, but the fourth is the one where the spiritual element becomes explicit, and so would be more controversial in terms of empirical psychology and things, certainly. And the point about these positions is that we tend to come across them through our life, beginning from when we were born, and we negotiate them for the first time through, chronologically, you might say. But then also there's a sort of a sense in which once you've gone through one position, it's there for you to access, to negotiate subsequently in life too. So they're synchronic and diachronic, to use technical language. And life tends to go well when you have good access to these different positions. So let me try and say what they are. The first one is broadly narcissistic in character. This is the young newborn child, desperate for its survival, you might say. Survival is the number one priority. And life is so organized for the child that's cared well enough that what it requires is provided for it. It's hungry, and almost as if by magic, you might imagine milk falls onto its tongue. It feels cold, and almost as if by magic, it's suddenly warm. It feels wet, and almost by magic, it's sort of dry again. This leads to some of the characteristics which pop up. For example, omnipotence can pop up in an adult narcissism, when you feel somehow the world should be ordered according to what you require or demand. And the idea is that the unborn child has to negotiate its narcissism, which is sort of good, it's required to survive. It needs to scream to communicate to a parent. But nonetheless, if that's the only mode of love that the child is capable of, it's going to cause it a lot of problems later on. So there's a kind of good narcissism, you might say, when you love yourself enough to get over yourself. You can feel comfortable in your own skin, and often, because this is very early developmentally, it often is a very embodied kind of experience. But to feel comfortable in your own skin, in a way, to love yourself enough so you can see there's more than just yourself in the world. You're not just the center of the universe. That's the first position. The child perhaps begins to get a sense that it's not the only creature in the universe, whole person in the universe, when it realizes actually that it's dependent upon a parent, probably, mother, probably. I think that this is quite a traumatic experience at first. If you've ever had children, you'll know that sometimes young children, they're hungry, but they refuse to be fed. They won't be comforted. They will hardly be held. They'll kick and scream. You put the blanket over them, they kick it right off again. And one way of imagining what might be going on here is the frustration and the anger, the hatred even, about realizing that you're dependent upon another. You're not as omnipotent, as it were, as you thought you might be. Certainly, if you look at the adult equivalent, you can read that, you can hear people talk about things in that way. So the idea is it's sort of inferred back. But the good thing is that if you can go through this pain barrier, you can move from the first position, one, the narcissistic dimension, to a dyadic relationship. So this is the second position, which, conveniently enough, is about two people. And life expands as a result. And I think this is one of the reasons why pain is always associated with love, and because an expansion, a growth of love, always requires kind of going through quite a traumatic phase. I know one of the things which you mentioned when we were talking before is what role will has to play in love. And I don't think you can will yourself to love in a certain way, but what you can do is sort of encourage yourself to go through the trauma in order that a new kind of love might open up. And dyadic love would be the second position. So this is, the young parent in love with their baby, the baby in love with the parents, the ordinary devotion, as Donald Winnicott rather nicely puts it. And then the idea is that this repeats, particularly when you first fall in love as an adult. Romantic love is the kind of adult version of this very early infantile experience, when all you want is to have and to hold. It's very possessive, a bit like, again, the parent and child. It's a rather exclusive love, too. Have you ever sat on a train when, two people are canoodling in front of you? It's deeply offensive. And I think it's not offensive because you're a prude about kissing in public. It's offensive because, in effect, they're saying, no one else matters. All that matters is my beloved and me. Spiritually, I think you see this in dyadic sort of religious language or sort of religious feeling. When, for example, all that's important is me and my relationship with Jesus. Or all that's important is me and doing my mindfulness meditation. It's like the whole of your spiritual life, as it were, depends upon owning or possessing this one either capacity or relationship. Now, in a way, there's nothing wrong with that. We all fall in love, but it's limiting again too. And so the idea is that the third position then comes along. And this, in the developmental psychology, is when the young child realizes that mum's not only interested in them, the parent's not only interested in them. There might be a father, there may be her work, there may be siblings. So the idea is that you enter a kind of triangular space now, as it's sometimes called. So there's not just the dyadic, two poles, but there's a triangular third position. It's very painful again to realize that there's not just one person you have to trust, but you have to sort of somehow throw yourself onto others, onto life itself even. Deeply unsettling experience. But of course, if you feel secure enough inside, all those kind of good qualities, then life expands again into this third position. I think it's both an external thing in terms of friendship would be perhaps the characteristic love of this phase, where you don't want to possess your friend, you want to be with your friend, and as it's sometimes put, not gaze into their eyes, but look straight ahead to step into life. So you can still see the triangular three-dimensional kind of notion here. And then religiously, I think that this capacity is reflected in the capacity to, say, critique your otherwise strongly held religious beliefs, to use metaphor, to be happy with aesthetics. You walk into a great building, and it's expansive. It has literally a three-dimensional quality. You don't have to be able to pin it down. You can let yourself into it. So there's a slightly different sort of spiritual capacity in that again, in this third position. Also enables you to not just have an experience, but to reflect upon an experience. So this is why mindfulness is such a powerful tool, because mindfulness cultivates this capacity to not just have an experience, but reflect upon it. And it has therapeutic value, because it means that over time, you're not just overwhelmed by panic, by anxiety, by depression, but you're able to step back from it slightly. And this too then has a kind of spiritual element when it's used in a spiritual context, to not just be in some kind of sense of religious feeling, but to be able to reflect upon it too. And that means that you can take a step back, and actually that makes for a bit of space around the experience that maybe lets more in. It's a way of cultivating spiritual growth, you might say. So that's 1, 2, and then the 3. And the idea is not that you kind of, once you're done with 1, you go to 2, and then once you're done with 2, you go to 3. But ideally, as an adult, you have good access to all of them, because you need some narcissism when you're older. You need a bit of narcissism to sit on a stage and to talk to people. But hopefully it's one where I don't feel so overwhelmed. I sort of feel more or less comfortable, so I can kind of get over myself a bit and communicate well enough. Similarly, you fall in love, you need to be able to do that, and similarly with the third position too, so that love can, as Eric Fromm put it, can move from falling in love to standing in love. So then you come to the fourth position, and I think this is where the spiritual dimension is the most fully developed. You might call it the transpersonal, you might call it the mystical. That can be quite complicated because it's not necessarily obscure, it's just a bit beyond language. It's something that's from the heart, perhaps, more than from the head. You get a sense of this when you meet people who have this capacity of relating, because there's something translucent about them. You feel they're fully there, but somehow there's more than them just there. I was lucky enough to sit in a room, quite a small room, with the Dalai Lama a couple of years back. It was his presence that was so profound, and I think that he must be able to occupy, as it were, this fourth position. There's a collective quality, an egoless quality, you might say, something translucent that comes through him. And I think that if you read people like Augustine in the Christian tradition, as well as others in different traditions, what they discover is that God, as Augustine puts it, was closer to him than he was to himself. There's a kind of another movement beyond just me and my friends, as it were, me engaging with things, but a sort of dropping into what you might sort not just love relationships, but love as the ground of being itself. A sense that compassion was there all along in the Buddhist tradition, you might say. And I think this reflects the positions and the movement between the positions, because in a way what the positions are is a discovery that, you thought it was just me, but actually there's another who's looking after me. You thought it was just me and my beloved, but actually there's a greater world into which we can all step. Our love overflows, perhaps into children, into a deeper experience of life. There's always more out there already to discover. And in a way, the fourth position, the most overtly spiritual position, just sort of completes that. It says, actually, what I've discovered is that love is the ground of being, that compassion is there all along. And so, in theistic traditions, certainly you'll read God is love. I think that's partly what that's trying to latch onto. And then I think other traditions have something similar to say too. Reason can never understand God, but love can penetrate through the cloud of unknowing.
The love that excites us, our imaginations most, is the kind that in English we fall into. It's a great expression because it encodes the apparently accidental nature of love, the lack of any control, the vertigo, the destabilizing, discomforting, disturbing aspects of the process. For even as the word love conjures up a mirage of blissful unity, of satiated desires, of Eden, what also unmistakably resonates in that deceptively simple phrase, to fall in love, is the sinful, the criminal, the anarchic, and thus the loss of innocence, the agony of separation, and the exile from Eden. I say this advisedly as someone who has only very recently fallen irreversibly in love into a new love. So this is really a dispatch from the front line. You see, I've just become a mother, so parents in the room and other mothers especially may well know what emotional upheaval I'm going through. If asked to name my feeling for my baby, sublime, fierce, ecstatic, joyous, painful, anxious, ambivalent, neurotic, and erotic, then love is probably the word. But goodness me, love, or my love, is anything but cozy. How then should I understand the ferocity of my feeling? It's oxytocin, the love hormone, a doctor told me. It's there to help you do whatever it takes, however many times a night, to protect your infant, to meet all his myriad demands. But while my love certainly protects my child, it is, I suspect, equally important that as he grows and develops, I strive to protect him from the force and intensity of my love. Because while now I'm still, I think, perfectly within my rights to be interested, as I am profoundly interested in the contents of every one of his nappies, there's always the risk that I'm going to become Philip Roth's Sophie Portnoy, manically banging on the door of her adolescent son in the bathroom and demanding to know what's going on in there. The family home, that most dangerous place, is a line from one of Adrienne Rich's poems, because how can we protect ourselves from those who really do passionately love us, and so who claim in all sincerity to have our best interests at heart? In a book I've yet to read called Doing Psychoanalysis in Tehran, a friend who's here told me that there's a passage about a mother's anonymous group, or a would-be mother's anonymous group, where mothers can go along and testify to their addictive, obsessive, crazy, stupid love for their children, and having done so, having shared, they can return to the job of parenting as if it were just a perfectly equitable management position, which is such a good idea, I think. But if a loving mother is someone who doesn't profess her love to her child too much, lest it weigh down too heavily, there are other problems associated with this dissimulation of her love, of her desire. Psychoanalyst Jean Laplanche said that because the breast can present itself to the child as an impersonal object there to serve a purely technical function, the mother's desire may communicate itself to the child unconsciously in such a way as to render the infant's own desire for the object fraught with unreadable, indecipherable meanings and demands that will leave their imprint on all the child's future relationships. I just mention that in order to make the point, really, that loving someone or even caring for someone doesn't mean you're not going to screw them or yourself up in unforeseeable ways. And I think that is an important point. In Lisa Opinionese's magnificent book, All About Love, she gives it the subtitle, The Anatomy of an Unruly Emotion. Unruly as in unrulable, anathema to every rule book. Love, that is to say, does not always make good government. When the philosopher Hannah Arendt was once accused by the scholar Gershom Scholem of failing to have love for her people, she replied that she can love only individuals, not nations, not abstractions. Love, she thought, was best left out of politics. As she put it, love, by reason of its passion, destroys the in-between which relates us to and separates us from others. Love can only become false and perverted when it's used for political purposes, such as the change and salvation of the world. Now, one can, of course, argue with her. There are so many different relations we call love, after all. But I am interested in the love that tends to be impolitic, in the love that is primarily a form of passion. And passion, according to another thinker, Emmanuel Levinas, is what hurtles us towards the other, the stranger, the unknown, whatever or whomever puts limits on the safe, the certain, the knowable. We're not passionate about things or people whom we think we have the measure of, whom we can see clearly. And nor is love simply something that we can be relied on to give charitably without demanding or expecting something, probably the equivalent thing, in return. Love makes us needy. It always risks turning us back into what we always, to some extent, are, babies. And it reawakens, I think, our infantile sense of helplessness, defenselessness, neediness. Love, says Levinas, turns into need, but a need that still presupposes the total transcendent exteriority of the beloved. Our passion for the other, in other words, entails the erotic impulse to merge with the other, to break down all boundaries, whatever seems to separate us, our bodies, our souls. But it only persists as passion or as love insofar as the other with whom and in whom we would lose or find ourselves continues to appear to us as unpossessable and unknowable, an absolute separation that can make us a little crazy. I think of a knitted artwork I once saw in a Louise Bourgeois exhibition that left a real impression on me. It was of a mother giving birth to a baby, and it included arrows pointing in the opposing directions of the two heads at that moment of giving birth, because separation, of course, begins at birth. So, contrary to what popular culture would sometimes have us believe, I think that love has the tendency, or it works, to deepen as much as to overcome our differences. In fact, I'd be tempted to question whether or not we would even be capable of perceiving our differences without love, since, as we perhaps know, the opposite of love isn't hate, which is a part of love, or it's certainly a part of my love life. The opposite of love is indifference. Indifference. I'll give a little example, and I think this example may well be one of the earliest sources we have of someone falling in love at first sight, and it comes from the Bible. When Jacob first sees Rachel at the well, before any words are uttered, he kisses her, and then he cries. And then he cries. Why the tears? Is his love unrequited? Certainly there are, as the story unfolds, hints that his desire for her may not be equaled by her. She has her heart set on something else, children. Leah, on the other hand, Rachel's older sister, who Jacob marries first and who has a very fruitful womb, names most of her children after the pangs of suffering she has felt because of her unrequited love for him, for a man who loves her younger sister, not her. Everyone in the story cries at some point. Leah for Jacob, Jacob for Rachel, Rachel for her children, because you can't fall in love, it seems, without a certain capacity for tears. For love, once acknowledged, forces us or confronts us with the inevitability, forces us to confront the inevitability of loss, of not being able to make sure of one's love. Indeed, a passionate life, a life of desire, is a life sustained paradoxically by what it lacks. We miss the other, the beloved, the lover, even when they're present, and even, or especially when, as it says in the Song of Songs, we kiss them with the kisses of our mouth. Pablo Neruda begins one of his most beautiful love sonnets, "Don't go far off, not even for a day," and then a little later, "Don't leave me, even for an hour," before finally, "Don't leave me for a second, my dearest." There beats the heart of a lover. Don't leave me for a second. What a desperate thing love is, how naked it makes us. All of this, I think, goes somewhat against the love that, according to the song, is easy. Love is easy in the sense that we fall into it, but I don't know if the consequences of love could be considered so easy. Is love all you need? Or is love all you want, all you crave, the only thing that motivates you? That's not the take-home message of the Beatles song, but it seems to me that the love we want, as opposed to need, is forever bound up with the dynamics of desire and ultimately the desire for desire itself. Indeed, if the question tonight is what kind of love do we need, then possibly a translation of that question is what kind of love can't we do without? And one answer to that may be that as we mature from babies into adults, as Mark has described, so the love we need must needs be transformed into the love we want. The love, in other words, that we can live without, which isn't at all to renounce one's demand for love or one's love of love, but it is to recognize that living without is at the heart of it.